Well, Nicki Minaj is proving once again that she has the most dogshit political instincts ever. She endorsed Andrew Cuomo for New York governor over Cynthia Nixon back in 2018, and she is now buddying up to the fascist Trump regime. She applauded the White House for using one of her songs in a TikTok video and also praised Trump for spotlighting Christian persecution in Nigeria, and even agreed to meet with UN Ambassador Mike Walls to talk about what the Trump administration is doing to protect Christians from persecution around the world. However, seeing as how she has a very sizable LGBTQ plus fan base, they didn't take kindly to her chumming it up with fascists who are currently trying to persecute them. And one person in particular responded to her Trump glazing, saying, "Nicki, as a diehard fan who genuinely sticks beside you through every single scandal, you cozying up to this fucking loser, I might actually have to tap out. We live in a country that wants to weaponize religion so your gay fans can be pushed into a corner and silenced." Now, this tweet in particular led to her crashing out, where she wrote in response, "Imagine hearing that Christians are being persecuted and not being able to have empathy for them because you are blinded by your own personal obsession with Trump. This says more about you than him, my darling." She added, "Imagine hearing that Christians are being murdered and making it about you being gay." She then goes on to rant about irrelevant things that don't actually address the substance of what her fan is saying before she eventually deleted both of those responses. But I'll be totally honest with you. I could not care less about Nicki Minaj and her dumb bullshit political takes and her subsequent crash out, but I think that this story is nonetheless important because it demonstrates how mischaracterized tragedies rise in salience while some of the worst atrocities on the planet go completely unnoticed. So is it true that Christians are being murdered in Nigeria? Yes, and in a country that is essentially 50% Muslims and 50% Christians, one would assume that we're looking at a civil war where Muslims are killing Christians in some sort of quest for religious supremacy, at least based on Trump's characterization of the events that are taking place in Nigeria. But in actuality, that's not the case. Not at all. As the Associated Press reports, attacks in Nigeria have varying motives. There are religiously motivated ones targeting both Christians and Muslims, clashes between farmers and herders over dwindling resources, communal rivalries, secessionist groups, and ethnic clashes. While Christians are among those targeted, analysts say the majority of victims of armed groups are Muslims in Nigeria's Muslim-majority north, where most attacks occur. And the attacks are being carried out by Boko Haram, who targets Muslims because they're a fundamentalist group that thinks individuals not Muslim enough deserve to die. Now, that's not to say that there isn't blame to go around because the Nigerian government has failed to rein in Boko Haram. But with that being said, it's interesting that Republicans have no concern whatsoever for Nigerian Muslims who are disproportionately being targeted by Boko Haram's violence. I mean, sure, care about Christians, but to not care about Muslims as well when they're being disproportionately targeted since they're centered where the violence is happening, that's definitely bizarre, wouldn't you say? But there's a reason for it. The reason why this is the case is twofold. One, because it furthers the narrative about all Muslims being inherently violent, and two, because it feeds into the right's Christian persecution complex narrative. And while Christian minorities are persecuted in certain places throughout the world, I don't necessarily think that Nigeria is the best example. Furthermore, Republicans usually speak about Christian persecution in developing countries as a warning for what could happen in the United States, not because they care about those people in those countries. When this whole claim that that could happen here is absurd, seeing as how Christians are a majority here who are persecuting other religious minorities themselves. So regardless if Republicans want to admit this or not, they're much more similar to the perpetrators of Christian persecution around the globe than they are to the victims of Christian persecution, since they hold the same fundamentalist religious supremacist views that lead to religious persecution in the first place. But I doubt Trump's sincerity here about Nigeria, because Israel has slaughtered Christian Palestinians in Gaza and bombed churches. They also bombed churches in Lebanon as well, and he hasn't said shit about that. In fact, he's continuing to funnel money and weapons to them as they commit these atrocities. So I don't think that he cares as much about persecuted Christians as he does about feeding into this narrative about the Christians here at home being persecuted as well. That just kind of bolsters the argument that he's trying to make. But the question is, why would Trump inexplicably start caring about people in a country he couldn't spot on a map when he's never talked about this country before? And the answer is because Fox News told him to care about this issue.
Sources tell CNN Trump has been laser focused on the treatment of Christians in the African country after a report he saw on Fox News while traveling aboard Air Force One. And just 24 hours later, he posted on Truth Social that the United States will cut off aid and go into Nigeria guns a-blazing. He confirmed the possibility of military intervention to reporters.
In other words, the national salience of some issues tends to be dictated by a sort of human centipede of stupidity, if you will. In the case of this story, it started with Fox News. They shit out that story directly into Trump's mouth. He then gobbled it up, shit it into Nicki Minaj's mouth, and then she is shitting it into all of our mouths, thus boosting the overall salience of that story even more than Trump possibly could. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to care about what's happening in Nigeria. In fact, you should, because the lives of both Christians and Muslims do matter, of course. But it's just a little ironic that this guy is choosing to focus on this African country, given recent events in el-fasher, Sudan, where the UAE-backed Rapid Support Forces, RSF, carried out a massacre that is so bloody, you can see the bloodshed from space. Literally. You can see it from space. And as Nesreen Malik reports, mass killings are underway. There are reports that in one maternity hospital alone, almost 500 people, patients and their families, were killed. The few that managed to escape tell of summary executions of civilians. The RSF has embarked on a killing spree of civilians so severe that images of blood saturating the ground have been picked up by satellite. The speed and intensity of killings in the immediate aftermath of the fall of el-fasher has already been compared by war monitors to the first 24 hours of the Rwandan genocide. This is the culmination of a campaign that had walled in the population of the city, hundreds of thousands of people, and reduced it to starvation. Those who attempted to flee risked death and rape, and those that remained were bombed and surviving on nothing more than animal feed. And Stephen Prager of Common Dreams reports that the ICC is already collecting evidence against the RSF, which points to them instituting a campaign of mass starvation and genocide, which includes a killing spree of 1,500 people in just 3 days, which is in addition to the 150,000 people killed since the civil war began back in 2023. And we haven't even mentioned the 12 million people who've been displaced and the 30 million people in need of humanitarian support. So we are witnessing a humanitarian crisis on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. And much like the IDF, the RSF is pretty open about their contempt for the people that they're slaughtering. They're literally filming their atrocities and uploading them to Twitter to boast about the crimes against humanity that they just committed. And I can't play any of that footage for you because it would obviously violate YouTube's terms of service. But I want to link you to a PBS NewsHour report where they do share you some gut-wrenching examples. They blur out the violence so you can't see it, but it gives you an idea of just how gratuitous the violence is. But I also want to talk about, stories from survivors here as well, and not just the violence, because these people are human beings. They're not just statistics or casualties to be thought of in the abstract. These are human beings who are suffering on a scale that is unfathomable.
Survivor Fatma Abdul Rahman tries to smile, but is burdened by unimaginable loss and trauma.
Shelling killed my daughter, injured my other daughter's eye, and paralyzed my son. I was hit by shelling. My body is full of wounds.
For the last 18 months, the RSF surrounded el-fasher, forcing residents to starve. It was a famine inside a siege that became a slaughter. Many fled here to Wila, the closest city to el-fasher. Ikram Abdelahmed's daughter and son-in-law were both killed, and so she is now raising her 2-month-old grandson with almost no food. For 2 weeks, she's fed him only moldy grain and rehydration salts, surrounded by a family that is shocked and shattered, as she told a local journalist.
We came running. They were chasing us, firing rockets over our heads. They took the men out and lined them up, and they shot them in front of us. They lined them up and shot them in the street and left them.
Another man fled alongside 200 people. Only 4 survived, as he told the UN's Population Fund anonymously.
My head was on the ground and I could see to my right 2 women, my neighbors, lying dead, blood flowing from their heads. Then the RSF got into their vehicles and started running us over. After they left, those of us who survived continued walking. Another RSF group caught us and demanded a $2,800 ransom from each of us. Only 4 of us managed to pay. The rest were killed. They killed children, the elderly, and women.
Inside el-fasher, the RSF left behind pools of blood large enough to be seen from space. Massacres across the city as documented by Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab. And the killing was targeted. The RSF murdered activist and former lawmaker Saham Hassan Hasabala, the youngest person ever elected to Sudan's parliament, back in her hometown of el-fasher, helping the hungry. And Mohammed al-Duda, who was the spokesperson for the nearby Zamzam refugee camp, he filmed these scenes of a people facing famine.
Right now we are in acute starving and acute hunger.
He was murdered this week for transmitting the truth.
So you have to understand that these are deliberate killings, and nobody spared. Not women, not children, not the elderly, no one. It's worse than anything our nightmares could possibly cook up. Like, this right here is inconceivable to me. I couldn't imagine, even if you survived that, how you wouldn't be scarred for the rest of your life and suffer through PTSD and trauma. It's just the worst possible thing a human being can suffer through. And the worst part is that none of this is really surprising, seeing as how the RSF is the group that emerged out of the Janjaweed militias, which is one of the perpetrators of the genocide in Darfur back in 2004. And it's worth understanding the events that led up to that genocide because it demonstrates how we got here today. And it all goes back to their former dictator, Omar al-Bashir, who tried to insulate himself from a coup by emboldening the Sudanese army as well as the RSF, but unbeknownst to him, he ended up empowering the very groups responsible for his eventual downfall, which then created this power vacuum that sent the country on a path towards civil war once the RSF leader, Hemeti, and the Sudanese army leader, Abdel Fattah el-Burhan, eventually started to clash over power amongst themselves. And Vox has a very in-depth video explaining all of this, but I want to play just a portion from that documentary to give you some additional context that I think you need to understand what's happening right now.
Darfur was in crisis. People here were historically neglected. Lack of medical supplies and necessary goods and little representation in Sudan's government left them feeling agitated for years. So, in 2003, while large portions of the army were tied up in the south, rebel groups attacked troops in this city in Darfur.
And Bashir, in recognizing that this rebellion was taking place, instead of relying on the Sudan armed forces or SAF, the conventional military, he instead decided to rely and arm local Arab militias in the region that were known as the Janjaweed.
This group was brutal and focused on wiping out Darfuri rebels and civilians at Bashir's direction. Satellite imagery shows that the Janjaweed is likely responsible for destroying over 3,000 villages. SAF troops in Darfur were responsible for destruction there as well. Both groups are accused of mass killing, rape, and the targeted displacement of civilians. Together, they killed thousands of Darfuris. The events in Darfur showed Bashir how to keep his power, and he turned to the Janjaweed in search of another protector. Among the Janjaweed militias, there were a couple of men Bashir trusted and tried to bring into the central government. But there was one particular Janjaweed leader that Bashir trusted the most, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or Hemeti.
Bashir called him my protection, particular play on the Arabic word Hemaiti, which is my protection, versus Hemeti, which is his nickname.
By 2011, the long and gruesome civil war here ended, with South Sudan gaining independence, leaving Bashir in a weak position. And soon after, Sudan's economy tanked. Many of the oil resources that sustained the country were based in the south, which was no longer under Bashir's control. To strengthen his power, Bashir gave Hemeti and the Janjaweed official status as a paramilitary force called the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, in 2013. At first, the group was placed under the NIS, Sudan's intelligence agency, also one of Bashir's protectors, even though they were supporting the SAF in the ongoing war in Darfur. Then, in 2017, he passed a law placing Hemeti directly under his command, making it clear that the RSF's main purpose was to protect him. To maintain the RSF's loyalty, Bashir gave Hemeti financial autonomy and allowed him to take control of some of Darfur's gold mines, smuggle weapons and minerals into places like Chad and Libya, and send troops into war-torn regions in exchange for money. At the same time, Bashir continued to let the SAF have a hand in major industries like weapon production and telecommunications. While Bashir was busy making these two forces richer, civilians continued to struggle.
Protests broke out in 2018 amid a really bad economic crisis.
That's when Bashir faced his biggest challenge, putting his protection scheme to the test. The ultimate trigger was the government's budget, which allocated about 60 to 70% to the security sector, which included Bashir's protectors, while Sudanese people struggled for basic needs.
So Bashir was this Trumpian-like figure who was using state resources to protect his own ass while everybody else in the country was going hungry. And that, of course, led to political unrest and eventually a revolution. And both the Sudanese army and the RSF decided to team up to overthrow Bashir after he was already weakened, which made them both de facto leaders of Sudan. But it wasn't necessarily a win for the revolution, even though they got the dictator that they wanted out deposed, because both leaders quickly turned on the protesters and cracked down on them hard. But over time, both of the men turned on each other because they didn't want to share power or cede it to a democratically elected leader. So the armed forces of both men started clashing in the streets. Burhan kind of had a monopoly on airspace, whereas Hemeti seemed to have an edge on ground warfare. And while both of these two men fought, civilians were tragically caught in the middle of these two warring factions. But over time, the RSF prevailed over the Sudanese army, culminating in them taking over el-fasher and committing the massacre that we're talking about as of the last couple of weeks. And I would highly encourage you to watch Fox's full video to truly grasp how we got to this point, because that does matter. I'm also going to link you to a video from Zateo where they detail the scale of the current humanitarian crisis even before the el-fasher massacre. But the fact that the RSF starved residents in el-fasher for more than a year with barely a peep from the international community just speaks to how the world has truly and utterly failed the people of Sudan. Like, that was a warning sign. They were starving this population and nobody thought to take it seriously, and here we are. They committed a massacre. People in hospitals were summarily executed. Women, children, the elderly, men. It was a bloodbath, and nobody thought to sound the alarm, at a minimum, even elevate the salience of this issue. But the RSF's power and military might didn't just come from Bashir. You have to understand that, because they're also being emboldened by foreign countries that back them. And while they have a plethora of funders around the globe, the UAE is by far their biggest state sponsor. And does anybody want to take a guess which other country is complicit? Just want to guess? You guessed correctly. It's our government too, because the UAE is our ally. And since we fund their military and they supply weapons to the RSF, we're guilty by extension. So our tax dollars are basically subsidizing genocide in Sudan, although to the US's credit, they don't deny that this is a genocide. In January, the State Department under the Biden administration determined that the RSF was indeed guilty of committing a genocide and announced that they would be sanctioning the RSF's leader, Hemeti, the individual named in the Vox documentary that we just watched, and also they'd be sanctioning 7 RSF-owned companies in the UAE. But of course, they stopped short of cutting off the UAE for funding the RSF. And Trump hasn't changed course either, which is why Democratic Senator Chris Murphy correctly points out that both Trump and Biden have allowed this to go on by basically not cutting off UAE, who's funding the bloodshed. But Congress is no better, seeing as how back in March, Senator Chris Van Hollen and Sarah Jacobs reintroduced legislation in both the Senate and House respectively to impose an arms embargo on the UAE until they agree to cut off the RSF. But I kid you not, Van Hollen's bill has 0 co-sponsors in the Senate, literally 0. Although the good news is that the House companion bill introduced by Jacobs fared a little bit better, getting 26 co-sponsors, all Democrats with the exception of one Republican, Don Byers of Florida. But overall, the United States and the entire world really has collectively failed the people of Sudan in the same way that we failed the people of Palestine and the people of the Congo. So I think it's really gross that Trump is trying to portray himself as some sort of humanitarian or hero, even though he's complicit with some of the worst atrocities in modern human history. And by the way, this asshole also vetoed a bill that was bipartisan, by the way, to end U.S. complicity with Saudi Arabia's genocide of Yemen back in 2019. So after overseeing multiple genocides as president, the one thing that I would say Trump is right about is that he's definitely not getting into heaven. But lucky for him, heaven doesn't exist, which is unfortunate because if there was an afterlife, Dick Cheney would be burning in hell right now as we speak. But I know you probably didn't expect a deep dive into the Sudanese genocide in a video with Nicki Minaj's face on the thumbnail, but I refuse to let the dumbest fucking people in this country set the agenda for what the rest of us are supposed to care about. In the same way that they hijack stories for their own self-serving purposes, I think we need to do the same, albeit for the purpose of the greater good, to highlight issues that aren't being talked about enough. And on that note, I want to use this opportunity to give you a little bit of a call to action so we can maybe make a bit of a difference. Call your senator and tell them to sign on to Chris Van Hollen's bill to cut off the UAE. And if your representative hasn't co-sponsored this as well, odds are they haven't, then tell them to do the same. They can sign on to the House companion piece authored by Sarah Jacobs in the House. Call them and demand that they do this. Be polite, but just ask them to end our complicity with this genocide that's taking place. Because, our government being complicit with one genocide, of course, is bad enough. But complicity with multiple genocides simply cannot stand. So make your voice heard.
Do yourself a favor and click the join button on YouTube to become a member. Because Mike's doing a great job getting to watch his videos before everyone else is tremendous. Many people are saying this. Join today, folks. You won't regret it.